Well, I want to invite you all back to another episode of He Said.
She said.
I'm Michael.
I'm Annie.
And Annie is a new voice that you had not heard in the past, depending upon when you listen to these podcasts. But it brings to mind that we're trying to invite other people with other opinions and other voices to be the she said. Mm-hmm. And maybe what we'll do is we'll replace the he said part as well at times. But at the moment, I'll be the consistent thing. So Annie, how are you?
Good. And yourself?
Good. I'm doing fine. Well, let's get right into it because we're trying to make it so that most of the podcasts are about 15 minutes, and we want to talk about he said, she said issues that might be of some importance to someone else. Now, one of the things that we talked about in a previous podcast, again, you may not have heard it, depending upon the order you listen to the podcast in. So one of the previous podcasts that Jamie and I were talking about was relationships that you invest time in and commitment in, and people say, well, why don't you just get married? You know, and somebody might say, I don't get married because it's just a piece of paper. And as we mentioned in that podcast, if it's just a piece of paper, why don't you go ahead and sign it? It's not a big deal. It's just a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And so if you say it doesn't mean anything, so what's the point of signing it? What's the point? Why not sign it?
Right.
So we wanted to piggyback off of that topic because I had a caller who said, would you guys discuss the idea of a guy and a gal who live together? They live at his place, which is kind of far from her place. And she goes and stays with him most of the time because she has a very limited part-time job. But she has just recently received an offer for a full-time job. She said, what do you think? Should I decline the job or should I accept the job? And I said to her, I think that it depends on whether or not you are in a committed relationship. That's where that piece of paper may come in. A committed relationship or not. So I said we would discuss it. We would discuss what other women, because I'm giving the practical answer. I mean, if you're not in a big committed relationship, take the job and see him once a week. But if you need the companionship and you need the...
If you see it progressing into a future relationship where there may be a said piece of paper signed or not, or you do see yourself living with that person or being with that person the rest of your life, it's worth possibly taking the risk, maybe even compromising, and hopefully your partner, if you're that close to them, maybe they'll compromise as well. Maybe they'll come and stay with you 50% of the time.
Right.
And you make compromises if you feel that commitment is there,
okay,
I think.
So then, but you said that taking the risk would mean not declining the job.
You could do that, yeah, if you really
feel...
So
the two risks are, you risk declining the job, and then the relationship does or does not go anywhere, and now you're out of a job that you could have had.
Right.
The other risk is you take the job, and you don't spend anywhere near as much time in your relationship, and the relationship dissolves. So what do you think as a woman is the better choice, and what is it dependent upon?
I think the level of risk is probably prevalent in planning ahead. If you have children, that maybe are outside of the relationship, you have to think about them first. If that's not an issue...
Yeah, she doesn't have any children, neither does he.
Then it has to do with just the relationship itself. Mm-hmm. How close are you to that person? How far in the future do you see that relationship going? Right. So you really have to backtrack and think about where has it been and where is it going to go, and make your decision based on that. Right. That's my opinion.
Now, you can't predict the future,
no.
So people will just make that assumption on logic. And a lot of times what happens, I think, is that men make a certain decision and women make sometimes a 180-degree different decision based upon our needs or our commitments or things like that. I, as a guy, if this was reversed, and I was a guy who got a great offer of a full-time job and I had only a part-time job and I was spending most of my time with my girlfriend, I probably would take that full-time job. Now, it might change if I had a really, really close, committed relationship. We were just about there, and now I got offered this wrench in the works. It might change things, but my first thing would be, look, business is business. You got to be settled. You got to be
secure. Especially living here in California, it's very expensive. So financially, that unfortunately, the financial situation comes into about 90% of the relationship is
Right.
based on that. Because if you're not comfortable and you're not financially comfortable, it affects your everyday life
Yeah.
in every aspect, emotionally, physically, and it affects your future. So you really have to practically think about that kind of stuff.
Okay, now, and that brings up a good segue, because nothing is just cut and dried, one question, one answer, problem solved. And so you mentioned finances, that's a big impact on a relationship. So let's just make a slight segue or a slight transition from that conversation about getting a job, being secure, deciding that over love and romance. So you have a guy who doesn't make very much money, and you have his partner who makes bank. And it used to be, in the old days, the guy was the breadwinner, and you'd come home and the wife was taking care of the kids. And he may become resentful because he's working his butt off, and all she does, quote, all she does is, take care of the kids. And so then it became pretty clear that all she does is quite a lot of work. And so if you have a relationship where he doesn't make much money, or he doesn't provide much security, and she provides all the money and all the security, from a woman's standpoint, how do you think that impacts your feeling about that guy?
Well, that's a good question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a tiny bit of experience with this.
Okay, go ahead.
But I can tell you that I'm a very headstrong, independent person, and that's the way I was raised. I was raised by a mom who was very headstrong, independent, do everything herself kind of person. So for me, it was a non-issue. I did go from taking care of the kids, and we flipped roles. I got 50-50. So I couldn't really feel some kind of way about it because I got to feel the other way. I think as a man, he felt possibly a little less efficient.
Yes.
And that did hurt his ego, I guess you could call it.
Yes.
So.
Well, let me inject this part at this moment because I have normally been in a situation where I'm not necessarily the breadwinner, but I am an equal breadwinner. So it's not an issue of
ego.
Not an issue of my ego.
Ego.
It's pretty even. I bring home a decent amount of money, so does she. So that's really not a big deal. However, I'm actually in a situation now where I have so many expenses because of a brand new venture that I'm trying to launch that I don't bring it home anywhere near as much money as my partner does. Not anywhere near as much money. And I sense a real resentment because I know what it feels like to not be valued for the jobs that are done. If you listed out the jobs that a couple needs to perform in order to have a successful relationship, someone's got to pay the mortgage, someone's got to pay for insurance, someone's got to do the taxes, someone's got to wash the dishes, wash the clothes, someone's got to clean the house, things like that. It doesn't mean that that's a woman's role, but those jobs have to get done.
Right.
So I noticed that when I was in a position, when I started in this position where I'm not as capable to provide equal financial input, so I picked up some of the slack. So I did some of those chores that have to be done. And my ego was disintegrated, more or less. It was disintegrated. And I felt the resentment and the like. So
now, do you feel like that's because of the resentment that was put towards you? Or do you feel like just because your role has kind of changed?
That's a good question. I think that I felt that way, and I still feel that way, partially because I shouldn't be in that position. And I'm not doing the thing that I was trained and raised to know that men do. But I'm reminded of that because I see kind of the resentment. So what I mean by the resentment, I can reverse it very easily. If I come home from a hard day's work, 14 hours at the factory, and I come home and she's watching TV. She had a hard day, but I don't know any of that. All I know is she's watching TV. So if I see that, I could see how there would be a little bit of resentment because it doesn't
At face value, it looks like, hey, look at you and look at where I'm coming from.
So because I can see how that would happen, that's not what's happening here. What I find is that when the bills come in, and I'm not putting in my fair share or an equal share into those bills, I see or sense or feel that resentment, that I'm not contributing equally, because I am doing a lot of other things that need to get done that my partner doesn't do, that I do only. And what the value of that is, who knows? But I know that I'm doing those other things. But I just feel that resentment, and my ego is shattered, and it actually affects my relationship, my physical, sexual relationship. And because I'm not feeling quite as macho as I once did, and so it affects me.
I was in both roles, so I mean, I felt the level of control was different when
Right.
I was home and he was working. It almost was like, well, I go to work and I make all the money, so I would expect that you would do this other part.
Right.
And then when the role was flipped, it was like, I felt the resentment from him. How dare I take over that role, kind of thing. So, but I never felt resentment towards him. I appreciated that he was home for the kids, or he was there.
Yeah.
And he may have contributed here and there with side jobs and things of that nature, but he didn't make as nearly as much as I was
that's
making.
the situation. I mean, yeah.
So, but I never resented him for that, because again, I was in that same position. We both had played those different roles, so we knew experience-wise what that felt like. But I could sense from him his ego crushed because he couldn't do those things that he did previously.
Yeah, I can relate. I feel it, and I don't know how often that happens in life and in relationships, but it does. That brings me to the next subject that I really want to cover on our next podcast, which is about relationships and how much you give, what the value is, and that saying, relationships are 50-50. Well, I, in fact, don't believe that relationships are 50-50 by any means. I think that's a failed relationship. I think that relationships are 100%, 100%. You give 100% of what you have to give, they give 100% of what they have to give, and if you're with the right person, that's the perfect relationship. So if you don't mind, maybe we'll pick that up on the next segment of He Said.
She said.
All right. Again, this is Michael.
And Annie.
All right. Thank you, Annie, for joining us, and join us next time.
Anytime.